Okay, welcome back, everybody. Our next speaker is Nate Richards, who's the president and CEO of Entrance Software, with offices in Houston, Dallas, and Denver. Nate is president of the company. He's a Rice University alumnus. He has over 10 years of experience in building custom technology solutions tailored to risks faced by the oil and gas industry. Nate is an expert at connecting the field to the office with data, allowing clients to make decisions based on the latest information presented in a meaningful way. With projects ranging from business intelligence to process automation and risk to profit analysis, Entrance has greatly reduced the dangers inherent to doing profitable business in the oil and gas sector. Nate authored Show Me the Metrics, an entrepreneur's organizational article that speaks to the 5 technology issues that can make or break business owners. He also wrote Passion, People, and Process, What Drives Your Business, which was featured on the Business Makers radio show, addressing what top entrepreneurs need to know to run an efficient business. He understands the workings of the oil and gas industry, especially upstream and midstream enterprise firms, and can speak to the problems that are costing those businesses time and money both today and in the future. So we're glad to have Mr. Nate Richards.
Thank you. All right. I was initially concerned that I might be the only thing standing between a hungry lot of people at an all-day conference and lunch, so I'm excited to see that we're able to eat while we learn today. Thanks very much for having me today. It's always fun to kind of hear what your marketing department wrote for your bio, and we do that, ask that kind of stuff. So today we're going to talk about how to frac your data and what does that mean. What does that mean? And specifically tying that to some of the issues that some of our other speakers have already talked about today, which is complex leases. The idea that of the standard lease is sort of the unicorn today. The idea that there is a standard lease or that there's some uniform way to administer leases. And there have been several references made to that by some of the other speakers today. And so what our business does is help companies use information to help eliminate some of the manual work and risk associated with that. So that's kind of what our topic is today. I just wanted to give a brief kind of expectations, kind of so we have the rhythm set for us today. Talk a little bit about my firm and what we do. Talk about this idea of frac your data, what is that about, and then spend the bulk of the time talking about what are some of the backgrounds, lease compliance issues that we're seeing out there, and then finish up with a case study that we did for one Eagleford company here in Houston. Of course, wrap up with Q&A. So first, about Entrance. Our company is based on the idea that information is the next big unconventional asset play, that where our company is going to look next to find value-creating opportunities. And we believe that you already have this information in your company. We think information is an asset. It's an asset that you invest in. It's an asset that you develop. It's an asset that you receive return on over a lifetime. It's an asset that ages, and if you don't keep it up and pay attention to it, the value can decline over time as data gets corrupted and goes out of date. We also believe in the idea of being fluent in energy. We work in not only in the upstream business, as we're going to talk about today, but we also work in midstream, downstream, and also on the service company side, both engineering, manufacturing, and also in the field. And work with all types of software, integration, data, workflow type problems there. The way we deliver this capability is through a combination of business and technology consulting. If you think about IT, I'm sure that you guys didn't imagine that you'd go and learn a whole lot from an IT guy today, but we tend to focus sort of on the I side. We don't do a lot with anything that plugs in. We focus on the people side of IT, which is all about the information in your business. And so we're kind of the IT guys that get our hands dirty. We get out in the field. This is some pictures from our website of us actually in the field working with a client, looking at reality of how applications and the ability to use data affect the business. We go to where the real work gets done, and rather than sort of sitting in the ivory tower like a lot of sort of IT initiatives end up dying on the vine. Many of you already believe this credo here from Ben Franklin. This is sort of a quote that's on the inside of our office as you walk in, that an investment in knowledge always pays the best interest. And if you're here today and are online, you believe this because you're here investing in your own knowledge and hoping to gain a reward from that. I'm going to have kind of a series of quotes today throughout the presentation, and so from people smarter than me, I find that quotes help tee up a problem almost better than you can say it yourself. Okay, so enough about entrance and what we do. Let's talk about this Frac Your Data idea. So we're sort of the Frac Your Data people. We help people increase the flow of information from all the data sources around their company so that it gets the right people at the right time. And let's talk about sort of what this looks like. So here's a company, and you've probably seen a diagram like this with these little silos of information and all these different areas of the company, and this is sort of a summary view of that. So what do we mean by this sort of Frac Your Data idea? Well, we sort of superimpose a layer of strata on that, and we think of your data sort of being locked up in other areas of the company, other departments, other geographic areas, in spreadsheets that aren't available to share, and that there's sort of this information seal, if you will, not allowing you to access those resources. So the idea of the Frac Your Data concept is that good software functions as a conduit from people to information, and that what you produce from that, to use another oil and gas term, is insight. So everyone here doesn't need more information. We're inundated with information. What we need is more insight, right? We want to know, what is the information telling us? What can we learn from this? What should we do next? What can we do better? And this is the concept behind this Frac Your Data. We think of it as affecting all of the typical personas you might find in an upstream firm. We sort of illustrate this as a listing of these people. This is sort of a poster that we have, an infographic that shows all of the different personas that you might have in kind of a typical oil and gas firm. And today we're going to talk about here, which is sort of our VP of Land, right? What's keeping, and our VP of Land in our infographic, this is Phil. Phil is our sort of token VP of Land, and we're going to talk about what's keeping Phil up at night these days. Information and access to the right information at the right time is not a part of oil and gas today, and specifically oil and gas exploration. It is the part. There was a time when just having the best science or being in on the early play was enough to sort of make money, buoyed by strong commodity prices on both liquids and gas. But today it's really about information. It's about how can you take this huge amount of information, process it efficiently, mitigate out risk, and find the opportunity. This is so if we're taking our personas, we think about this as a typical oil and gas org chart. We think about information as flowing sort of from the bottom up, right? As operations, as things are taking place in the field, in the office, information is sort of bubbling up throughout the organization. And communication and decisions are sort of coming down, right? Management is sort of deciding what's the strategic direction of the company. Those decisions get made and get communicated down through the organization, and that drives action. Obviously, there's a cycle here, right? So as we make a decision and we take action, that generates some data. We're able to see the side effects, the results of that action, and we're able to collect that data and communicate it back up the org chart. That gets analyzed, filtered through a strategy. What is our exploitation strategy? What's our approach to this asset, right? Which drives, hidden there by the video, decisions, right? And this cycle is something that is found elsewhere in the world. It's the Deming cycle, which W. Edwards Deming pioneered at Toyota. And anyone here who drives a Toyota or a Lexus, maybe in the oil and gas business today, more common, you'll know that those are very reliable vehicles. And how did Toyota go to create such a massive, reliable execution on manufacturing? Well, they did it by having this idea of constant feedback and constant innovation in small loops. And they call this the lean manufacturing process. So what does this have to do with oil and gas, and why do we see this lean manufacturing process having relevance in the oil and gas business today? It's primarily because shale as a business looks a lot more like a manufacturing operation than it does some sort of wildcat operation. You know, earlier today we heard that shale is really not a matter of is the oil there. It's a matter of can you get to the right place? Can you extract it efficiently? Do you have the supply chain connected efficiently? How do you market it, et cetera? And so we see this need for information driving the shale piece of the industry so much more even than other types of assets. We also see that this process is a backward-looking one, whereas the oil business tends to be always forward-looking. What's next? What's next? In order to drive lean manufacturing type concepts, you have to look and say, how did we do? And you see that again in shale because of the number of wells and the linearity of the process. You see people looking back and saying, how was this fracking technique? How was this, and what can we change next on the other one? What about where we perforate, how we perforate, and so forth, how we produce the well throughout its life cycle? Looking back on that so that when you do it again, you're constantly innovating, driving down well costs. And you see, just by looking at public disclosures of companies that focus in shale plays, what do they talk about, right? It's how their cycle times are decreasing, how their drilling costs are going down, how their lifting costs are going down, how as they learn to exploit the play, they get more and more efficient. Okay, so how does this affect Phil? Because that's who we're going to talk about today, right? Phil's concerned about possibly one of those HHBP leases that we heard about earlier today, hopefully held by production, right? He's concerned about that. It's keeping him up at night. And so we're going to come back to how is he affected by this sort of manufacturing process, and how can information help him out with some of those concerns. Quick quote here from E&P Magazine last year describing shale as a manufacturing process. We're like a factory that's producing wells daily and then using those wells to produce natural gas. Lean manufacturing by its concept relies on comprehensive reporting. You must know where your problems are to avoid them or at least respond to them quickly. So part of the information value proposition is avoiding problems, in other words, not realizing risk. The other side is about responding quickly. So one is proactive and the other is reactive, and you really want to address both concerns. So here's the kind of linear process that you might break down shale exploration, right? Prep for drilling and get to first sales. So you have, and this is a general concept here, but you can see sort of a linear progression, right, at which there's sort of an end point. And so you can sort of measure what is your efficiency through these different buckets of activities, right? How long does it take? How much do we spend? Is there variability? Can we improve it? And so what is Phil doing throughout this process? Obviously, assembling the lease inventory, doing the title and securing right-of-way. There's a land sort of element and all of that. But in addition, he's got other things that he's worried about. So Phil wants to know, am I about to lose a lease? And kind of what's possibly keeping Phil up at night? What's on his mind today? He's worried about landowner relations. That's something that we read a lot about and something we're going to focus on today. How do you deal with your lessors? Managing leases in the secondary term. Again, this is becoming more and more a reality, especially as shale plays are more and more mature. Dealing with leases in the secondary term as primary term leases. And what else? Complex lease provision tracking. Again, what we're going to talk about today. And all of this in today's technology world, what we see is it's mainly driven through spreadsheets. Meanwhile, he's working on the next acquisition package and doing due diligence on that. So these are the things that is keeping Phil up at night, and that sort of tees up the issue of complex lease compliance. So what are the things that are going on in the kind of complex lease world today, and what is kind of the background, and why do we care about this? First off, I want to know, have you been cheated out of millions? Does anyone, you guys live in Houston, anyone recognize where this is coming from? No? Okay, well, we'll see if you recognize this. So we talked about plaintiff's attorneys already today. Here's a well-known Houston plaintiff's attorney, and see if you notice a trend in the billboards posted here, right? Started out as 18-wheeler wrecks, next we went to BP oil spill, and now we're just general oil and gas lawsuits. 1-800-lawsuit is all you need to know if you want to go sue an oil company. This was in Houston. There was one right above the Galleria for probably the last 18 months. I think it's down now. There's a casino there or something now. But this was right above the Galleria, and there was another one on I-10 in the Energy Corridor. And I was like, it's so funny to drive past that every day on the way to work. If you went and looked on this guy's website, it's sort of read, and you guys probably can't see it down here at the bottom, but I mean, the first cover of it is all about sort of personal injury lawsuits, and then if you drill down, you see, well, what is this oil and gas specialty that they have? Well, it's a phone book of different plaintiffs' complaints that you might have around royalty disputes, topside surface rights, and things like that. One quote even says, with today's oil and gas markets in high gear, investment opportunities abound in the field. I don't know what that has to do with the plaintiff's attorney. Oftentimes, while you and your partners may have the best of intentions, inevitably other parties fail to deliver on their contractual obligations. Empty promises turn into lost profits and potentially large damages. And that's where really we start to see the plaintiff's attorneys get interested, right, in the large damages part. So this is one icon. This guy's a bit of a caricature, perhaps. Maybe not every plaintiff's attorney is sort of this bold with the statements. But what we are seeing is that there's obviously a trend and an uptick here, and we're seeing it. So don't take my word for it. We'll ask the all-knowing Google, what is the trend for oil and gas royalty disputes? And there's lots of different ways you could kind of measure that. We went and, we're a Microsoft shop, so of course we have to do Bing as part of our, dedication there. But 6 million hits on oil and gas royalty underpayment lawsuit, 1 million hits for oil and gas royalty lawyer. Now, probably a lot of those aren't necessarily plaintiff's attorneys, but that's about 6 lawsuits per lawyer by my math. But something that we're seeing more and more. Those numbers are going up. In addition, we talked about sort of these royalty specialists. I think one of the terms used was lease-busting lawsuits that we're seeing earlier today, and this is kind of becoming a niche. It's becoming a skill set out there. I spoke to a conference mostly for in-house counsel in the fall, also about lease compliance, and a lot of the presenters in that conference as well, was a 2 or 3 day conference, talked about concerns around just old leases, the sort of inability to deal with the lack of standardization, especially in these new geographies. And one running theme is that plaintiff's attorneys are getting better. Right? It used to be easy to just squash them. They're getting more skilled, more versed in the art. They know how to read a lease. They know how to adjudicate it. So this is a trend that we're seeing. So a couple of sample quotes. We just went and did a little search here and see what are people saying. And then again, we're talking about eras of unprecedented profits in oil and gas companies, kind of the big bad oil company here. The American royalty owner is still very much at risk of being unfairly compensated by operators who routinely fail to pay fair royalties. Some producers make underpayments because of complexities involved in oil and gas leases. So here we are talking about complex leases. Here's another guy. I'm not even sure if this website's around anymore, but he describes the royalty owners as the Davids versus the Goliaths when it comes to their rights. And last here we have them, sort of inciting the opportunity to break an existing lease, this idea to remarket, rebonus an existing lease, and sort of this lease-busting litigation that we heard about earlier today. So there may be some circumstances that allow you to break this lease and renegotiate it at current market rates, more favorable to the landowner. We also see this in the news. I'm not picking on Chesapeake here, but this was the first one that came up here. But Chesapeake has faced some royalty underpayment lawsuits that have been publicized in the last few years. Here's Molly Ryan. She writes for the Houston Business Journal on oil and gas and also on technology. So we actually follow Molly, and she's written a couple stories about us over the years. And here we have a guy who looks to be, is he concerned with compliance? I don't know. So here we have Aubrey McClendon also, again, just being interviewed about landowner lawsuit claims of underpayment of gas royalties and related lease disputes. So this is a real thing. We're seeing it. We're talking about it. What are we doing? So I'm not here to tell you that this is a new concept, that we have discovered this issue about oil and gas lease compliance, that you have to be compliant with leases, and that sometimes that's difficult. But the drive into shales and the velocity with which that's happened is driving new risks, new data that has to be tracked. We heard about the sputter rig issue. How does that affect continuous drilling? How does those rig move on and release dates drive those types of provisions? And that's another thing you have to sort of pay attention to as an operator. Another thing we heard about today is oil and gas law maturity and also geographic variability. A lot of shale plays are in places that haven't traditionally had a case law depth around oil and gas law or necessarily objective sort of referenceable court positions on these energy issues. We also have the lease standardization extreme. So you've got sort of places like the Barnett where there are tons of small tracts with more simple, shorter, more standardized leases, and then places like the Eagle Ford where you tend to have large leases, proprietary leases for large tracts on the ranches out there, and everything in between. We already covered the plaintiff lawyer quality and ability. So what are the risks to the operator? Obviously, lease jeopardy is one of those things. Fees, compensatory royalties, litigation, and time. Time is one that we often miss in that, you get tied up in these issues as an operator, and of course you may win the deal at the end of the day, but you think about the time and the resources expended to get embroiled in these risks, and there's a better way. So what are the two things you can do to keep yourself out of these things? Well, number one, you can write good leases, and that's what all of you are so excellent at and are here to learn about today. Here's some sample cases from the last couple of years. If you go out and do some searching around complex lease compliance issues, we have a couple here. In this first one, it was lucky that no pooling had taken place. The landowner sued and said that, there hadn't been continuous operations on one area and wanted to sort of avail themselves of the Pew Clause, but ultimately they had some variances from sort of the standard lease form in their addendum that didn't take into account non-unitized land. So again, a lease sort of got off on a technicality, but the issue isn't necessarily that that was decided in the operator's favor, but the idea that if the leases were clearly written and some of these new modern concerns were taken into account, then possibly that whole action could have been avoided. Several other here about vagueness in leases around when you have a continuous drilling operations clause, what does that mean? Which dates are they keyed off of? What constitutes an operation, and so forth. So that's sort of on the crafting side, how do you draft leases? On the other side is, okay, the fact remains that a lot of your leases today you didn't draft, and you don't necessarily have a choice in how they're written, and yet you have to administer them. So tracking the leases in a rigorous sort of fashion is kind of the other side of the coin. Here's a couple other cases recently. The Texas Journal of Oil and Gas and Energy Law. This is their fall edition from last year. I just in browsing that. There's a study here on sort of the history of the discovery rule and particularly around fraudulent concealment and how does that affect the statute of limitations extension and that sort of thing. So I'm not an attorney, and so that's really not my focus, but the issue here is that what sort of ruled for the day in the operator's favor is that there was this sort of publicly available information that should have put the lessors on notice about all of these different types of issues. They're all these suits are on different types of action, different sorts of complaints, but all of them ultimately tie back to that the lessor was on notice because of this publicly available information. So the point here from our perspective is that the information is out there, and it will, lessors and their attorneys are learning about how to be informed, right? And they are going to avail themselves of this information. And so as an operator, you should expect more action from informed landowners And if you're not paying attention to the same information and managing it with the same level of rigor, you could have issues of surprise that tie you up and take your eyes off the ball of exploiting the asset. The next, actually in the same issue here, talks about this other case that was recently decided in Pennsylvania about what constitutes production paying quantities in Pennsylvania. Ultimately, again, the court sort of just decided that to defer to sort of Texas and some of the more established interpretations of what that means, which is that just because a well lost $40 in 1956 or whatever the claim that was made here doesn't mean that well doesn't pass the RPO standard. And so, again, my point isn't on the legal interpretation of these cases, but my point is, here's an operator that wasn't paying attention. They didn't have the data. They didn't have the history. And what are you doing about your leases that might be marginal? And what is marginal, right? And what drives the marginality of those leases, and what drives the importance of where you're spending your time in terms of paying attention to what data do we need to be watching so that we conduct our operations accordingly? Okay, and there's many, many more. The point here is tracking in terms of analysis of your existing portfolio, tracking that data quantitatively can help mitigate risk. So what are CEOs saying about some of these complex lease issues? This is from last summer's TIPRO summer conference up in Dallas. Gary Evans now, I don't know if he's as concerned, having just sold his Eagle Ford assets off a couple of weeks ago, but probably a load off his shoulders, but he's got other shale assets to worry about. But he said he feels like he's got a gun to his head. You've got to drill a well or you're going to lose a lease. That's a direct quote from his presentation last year. So what are the business drivers for change here? What's going on? We talked about kind of the legal background, plaintiffs' attorneys sort of seeing the deep pockets there, the new deep pockets, the oil and gas companies, the novelty of operations, right? The idea of that, the whole industry is learning to pivot over the last 2 or 3 years, right, from being very much focused on different types of assets. And layer on top of that the competition, right, the drive to take acreage and maybe cut corners in order to get it, the velocity at which this business is picking up. We could just show one U.S. gas reserve replacement rate, and you can see that you have sort of the graph from the peak oil days, and then you layer shale on top of that, and it's just explosive. You have also the value, right? There's a lot of value out here. The sweet spots are very sweet. It's been said that 80% of the profits are made by 20% of the operators, and so there's a lot of people looking to be in these zones, and again, that drives compromise, that drives corner cutting, it drives the need to rush a deal to be done and potentially take on risk. So that's in the operations world. Legal, again, we kind of covered this. Owners are becoming more sophisticated and more represented by more sophisticated counsel. And just this perception sort of mass market-wise that the oil companies are making all the money at the expense of all the individuals. It just makes things sort of more contentious out there. On the land side, just the number of leases and lessors, again, as the industry pivots to look at being largely offshore large capex versus onshore high velocity, right? It's very polarized in that regard. This land departments, engineers, everyone is sort of redoing. I have a friend he's been an offshore engineer for BHP until they acquired Petrohawk. Now he's working in West Texas, and it's like learning a new trade. It's still engineering, but it's just so different. Like what his day looks like, what his month looks like, what is he measured on? Everything operationally, companies are transforming almost overnight to new business models, and the same thing goes for land. Lease complexity and standardization, we talked about some kind of polarizing extremes there. And one other thing I want to talk about is this land administration oversight. So this concept and what is the role of land admin, and who is charged with administering leases in a given E&P firm. something that we see is it just varies so widely. Is it a legal concern? Is it land? Is it land and legal? Is there a land legal department? Is there a land administration department? Who do they report to? What are their objectives? How are they staffed? Are they staffed with people with deep experience? Are they staffed with people who are, some are interns? And what are those people reviewing? How do they get their data? How do they know what they're looking at and what the importance of that or risk to the company is as a result, and what action maybe should be prudent or they should take? All these sort of issues in the land administration area. And then last, we have our IT sort of data quality issues, different data sources that disagree on different key pieces of information. How do you resolve that? Silos, meaning we have our land data over here, we have our drilling data over here, we have our production data over here, we have our financial data over here, and there's no flow between, right? And product feature lag. Land area is somewhere in the E&P space that has traditionally sort of maybe lagged in the software technology world, as opposed to look at what happens in G&G or even in the operations side of things. It's catching up. It's catching up, especially as we see a lot more sort of field activities for land departments today. But generally, the features of a product are driven by the need and how long that need has been there, and is there a market demand that justifies going out and building these software tools. And software products always lag, and in industries that innovate at a rapid pace, they have a hard time keeping up. So that's just another thing that we see that drives some of the risks here. So here's a quote. This is from Anadarko's website about land administration. They protect the company's assets. Sounds like an important job. Including oil and gas leases and the wells which are drilled on those leases. Typical job duties include the analysis of provisions of various leases, deeds, rights of way, and agreements involving the company assets in order a property record base can be created or maintained. The interesting thing is that this is a summer intern position posting that requires like a three out of 4 years to be completed from college and no real relevant industry experience. Now again, I'm not picking on Anadarko, or I hate to even use names, but it's just an example of who are we as an industry? Who are we putting on this problem, right? What resources are we putting into on the field to go and get the win in lease administration? So wrapping up on just the background of this problem, what are some of the strategies that work? Well, first of all, it's a cross-departmental concern. There's no single department that has the whole story on what's happening on a lease today, and we see firms, especially independents, the majors get the importance of data and administering of that data, and that it needs to be shared, and that workflow is important, and that people and experience and passion is just not enough to get it done. We need systems, okay? But the independents, not as much, okay? There are exceptions, but in general, it's not as much. And companies that have these siloed sort of stores of information are all the more at risk in that there's not the collaboration going on that needs to take place. We have some software in land. We put everything in there, and it just tells us what we need to do. Conventional land software is not enough. All the clients that we work with, they've got maps. They've got, all this great software, but ultimately because of the first bullet point here, which is that the land data is not enough to tell what risk you might be ready to realize. And land admin is just not standardized. I mean, every company has a different idea of what this is, what their roles are, again, who's on the team, who do they report to, what are their objectives in the business. And the current state of the art is sort of the landman in a spreadsheet. I mean, to be truthful, what we see with our clients when we go in is that, a couple of people have a spreadsheet where they keep track of stuff. They check it every so often, once a month, once a week, once a quarter, and they'll go and make some calls and see, hey, have we drilled over here? Did we do anything? Okay. And often they're not the all-stars particularly, and we're on something that really takes experience to understand the gravity of what they might be looking at. And last, again, it's just sort of it can be even paper and manual process. Okay, so last I want to finish with a case study from a firm that we worked with, sort of a mid-sized firm, So I'll give you a little background on the case study. So they have operations in the Eagle Ford under active development, and they also have some leasehold in kind of the early stages and some other shale plays. For them, land admin reports up through the legal, and they have many complicated leases, as you might expect, based on that geography. Typical IT, multiple system vendors. IT tends to be more tactical as opposed to strategic, meaning the line of business buys the software and says, here IT, we decided to get this new database, you support it. And so there's not a consolidated or a centralized strategy in terms of, as a company, we have information. Assets move through this life cycle. And during that life cycle, they're represented in all these different databases, all these different systems. And how do we make sure that what we learned in System 1 when the asset sort of moved through its maturity life cycle, that that data comes along with it, that the learnings move with that asset? There's not a focused effort around that. And again, with this client, as with any initiative, especially in E&P, again, and in shale, just because of the speed, it requires a focused team effort. Meaning you can't just stop and say, well, we'll deal with those risks another day because we have to work on the next M&A deal. It requires focus and importance and sponsorship in order to get this successful. So what did we do? First of all, we started with a lease review. In this case, again, mid-size operator, it was not beyond the scope of feasibility. And also something that maybe hadn't been done with the level of rigor that it probably needed to. We are not doing the lease review. We're not a land consulting company, but we did, on this team that delivered the ultimate solution, was a land consulting company that came in to actually do the subjective review of the leases. They give to us a set of defined structures of terms that they're finding, and what are the input parameters, what are the drivers, the key dates, the key quantities that need to be measured in order to measure compliance with these particular lease forms. Then we take that information and we went and said, where does this information exist in the company today? Right? This is what we call data mapping, kind of an IT term. But basically, we want to go find these needles in the haystack, right? Because someone has this information and it's obviously not being communicated on enough timely basis. Again, maybe there's a spreadsheet that's emailed once a quarter. It's not communicated enough so that they could get an early warning or early enough warning that they're entering in sort of a yellow light sort of period on a particular lease. Basically, if there aren't some activities of a certain type in the next N days, you could have some risk. And this is the end point, right? This is where we're trying to get. Is there a way to know in advance that we might have some risk exposure? So we locate where are these systems, where are they, and how do we map to where the data needs to go? So if it needs to end up in the land system, if it needs to end up in the drilling system, how are we synchronizing and keeping that all in check? Next, we went and cleaned up the data, because what we found is as we went and looked through these different source systems, there are multiple copies. This data exists in multiple places, right? And you'd be surprised how many different versions of the truth there might be for something as important as, say, NRI, right? If you look in the economic system, if you look in the financial decks, if you look in the reserves model, if you look in the drilling software, if you look at production, they all disagree with respect to something as simple as NRI. So part of this effort requires some cleanup. If these are key pieces of information to know exactly what they are, then they need to be correct. And the company's committed to that in order to get to this endpoint of. We need to be aware of what risk we are entering into in advance, as opposed to getting a call from an attorney or an upset landowner. Last is integration on the data side. We have to link these systems so that the source data, where it exists today, flows in to where the users are, and synchronizes again those copies to sort of the master copy. Next, we have to have a way to administer lease revisions. So we're onboarding leases, we're revising leases, right? There has to be some administrative capability to sort of put in these sort of standard or non-standard, perhaps, clauses in a way that generates new tracking capabilities, and that there's a go-forward plan. In other words, we're not just getting a snapshot in time, we have to come back and do it again next year, right? But the system has the ability to sort of maintain this capability going forward. And then last is, okay, we have all the data, we know the structures, what do we do with it? Well, we want to send out alerts to the people who need to know in advance of this sort of risk activity. So we've got to design how sensitive are we to this type of risk and who needs to know about it. And if the system still doesn't see, for example, drilling activity on a lease where we saw a rig release date, the last rig release date was 60 days ago, within what window of time does that need to get escalated, right? Because the drilling software hasn't shown any activity, right? So what are those sensitivity cases and what's the escalation path? Okay, so what types of clauses, let's get a little more specific, would you maybe track here? So there's all types of clauses. In fact, many of the ones that we've already discussed today. Cessation of production, right? There's some key pieces of data you need from the production system that tell you what is the status of the flow at this lease. Continuous drilling, continuous operations, the variance of that type of clause. With and without, I have banking here, banking deferment days. You think about deferment wells, deferment days, lots of different types of continuous operations or minimum activity type clauses, both during the primary and the secondary term, depending on the type of lease. In other words, you have to drill so many wells per unit of time, and if you drill more than that, then you have some deferment, right? In other words, you can use those as credits later. And again, having software that knows these complexities and can automatically tell whether or not, where are you in the sort of red light, green light spectrum. Rig release dates, spud dates, lots of other sort of drilling dates, depending on the language in the lease. That was talked about earlier, more in the context of joint operating agreements, but which date is the key date is important. And, if you have sort of an analyst who thinks that all of them are the same, right, and they're looking at the wrong date, you could have an issue. Royalty escalation, the type of clause that a lessor will put in there, thinking you'll never hit this. Well, there's leases that hit these objectives, and the interests need to change. And a lot of times we find out after the fact that, the interest has changed too late. Marketing type provisions, what was the price that the royalty gets paid on? How do we track that? What's the language in the lease? Do we need third-party data? Maybe these prices, it's the highest price listed within this time in Gas Daily for at this hub. That's not in our land system. That's not in our financial system. So we have to pull in some third-party sources of data. And things like production and paying quantities. Again, what is our sensitivity to that? How often do we need to look? And then offset wells. I had one very large company come and talk to me after giving this presentation in the fall and say, what do you guys do how do you handle offset wells? Because, we just go to drillinginfo.com and we kind of look where our leases are and see if there's any well activity around our leases, and we kind of check every now and then. That data is available. You can pull it down. You can cross-reference it with your lease boundaries and automatically get alerts as to when there's been drilling activity in and around your leases. That's easy to do. Okay, so what does the whole story look like? So those are kind of the types of clauses that we might be looking at. Last is, where do we pull the data? So we're pulling it from production, from drilling, from land, and from other places, marketing, the financial system. So what does this look like? Remember sort of the Frac Your Data graphic. The idea is that the people who need the information aren't where the information is, and so we have to get it piped to them. And so here we are starting out. This system is pretty straightforward. You sync up the source data into a centralized database. You populate your lease provisions. You configure the system. You set up your reports and alerts, and that's basically the system. And then the system just runs, and obviously there's some routine sort of administration type tasks that keep it going. But that's about as simple and as complicated as it gets. So the results is we're able to track some of these type of clauses. And one thing I wanted to note is that it's an ongoing iterative process. This isn't like something you do one time and you have this sort of forever type answer. Every lease is a little different. And as you make changes, again, you have to keep up this data in order to realize the benefits. I included this for people who maybe downloaded, but what is some of the background information on some of the sources here that's around lean manufacturing and some of the data-related issues, and here's some of the legal and compliance issues. We have a white paper. I have some copies if anyone's interested in more detail, and I'll take questions. Thanks. Yes, sir. Yeah, it didn't get uploaded. It's probably my fault for making changes up until the last minute, but yeah, it'll go up on the HAPL site. We'll see that it's uploaded. Yes, ma'am. Is there a more effective lease management program than others? That is just so subjective. I wouldn't say. So we look at it through the eyes of whoever our customer is, right? And that's going to be dependent on what type of assets do you have, most IT guys, it depends. The answer is it depends, right? How big is the company? What is the volume of activity? What is the volume of leases? What does your headcount look like in-house? Do you outsource any of that stuff? What is the exploitation plan? How long do you plan to hold these assets? Where are they geographically? Yeah, all of that would be a filter on my answer, unfortunately. But there are. It's like any tool, right? It's the right tool for the right job. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing, right? There is no general solution to this stuff, just like there's not a general way to drill a well, right? There's some basic commonalities, but you have to look subjectively if you really want to get the best answer, and that was your question. Any other questions?
Nate, does your company handle land data administration solely on its own, or does it dovetail with the existing land system?
Yeah, absolutely. So nothing that I've talked about today would be in any way a replacement to any existing systems. The idea is to use the data you already have in these systems, right? So your P2s, your Land Pros, I'm just talking about land software specifically. Obviously, there's a whole spectrum of oil and gas software that you may have. And every company, the interesting thing is every company has a different kind of portfolio of applications. And it's that unique permutation that creates a very unique problem when you try to bring all the data together, right? Everyone has a little bit different combination. We use BOLA, we use Excalibur, we use Inertia, all the different variants, enterprise upstream, depending again on how big or small you are and what type of assets you have, how long you hold them, what your exploitation strategy is. All of those things drive that. But no, it's not a replacement for any existing software. All that software does what it was designed to do very well. So it's not an issue of not having tools in that area. It's an issue of using the data that we have already in these systems, but getting it to users in a way that they can more easily consume it to make decisions.
Any questions from remotes, Cameron?
Any remote questions? Okay. All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nate. Excellent. Really excellent and interesting presentation. Thank you, Nate. We're going to take a break and be back in about 10 minutes.